Εξομολογήστε τον Κύριο διαγρατός, αλληλούια, ότι στον αιώνα το έλεος αυτού, αλληλούια.
Cool. So, before we start, my name's Thomas, by the way. Nice to meet you. James?
Yeah,
nice to meet you. This is SY.
Nice to meet you, man.
Nice to meet you.
So, me, James, and SY have agreed to do a discussion on agnosticism and modes of credibility for the Christian faith. What that means is we're going to attempt to give modes of credibility or arguments that justify the Christian religion to the gentleman here, and we'll exchange ideas and discuss the topic in an eloquent manner as we should at Speaker's Corner. But before we get into, so the first thing we're obviously going to want to go to is, does God exist? But in order to determine which argument for God I want to use, let me just ask you, how familiar are you with arguments for God's existence?
I don't know how many there are to be familiar with. There are a lot of them.
Yeah, have you heard of like the contingency argument and stuff like that?
Contingency as in God has to rely on the creation and stuff like that.
Contingency as in some things are necessary, meaning they exist in all possible worlds. Some things are contingent, meaning they could fail to exist. Contingent things depend on something else for their cause, which implies a necessary being.
So
that
contingency
kind of
means relying on something else to exist.
Well, that would be a feature of something which is contingent, but what we mean by contingent is just that that thing doesn't exist in all possible worlds. And what we mean by the way, I'm not attempting to use the contingency argument right now, I'm just explaining it to see where we are in our understanding of arguments for theism.
Just trying to understand the words.
So a contingent thing would just be something that could fail to exist. So for example, if your parents didn't procreate to have you, you may have failed to have existed, correct?
It depends what you're classing as me, my physical atoms or my consciousness and myself.
Well, when we're...
Because my physical atoms will always be there.
Yeah, when we're designating you, we're designating like a particular instance of humanity. So for example, you instantiate the whatness of a human, right? We would call the subject you a human. We would say that for each other. So we're saying that subject is contingent in the sense it could have existed, it could have not.
Yeah, so this particular human is going to eventually die.
Yeah.
And it won't be as a human being ever again. It will be in particles, or my soul will go somewhere else.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So I think
the parts will always exist, but not as a whole.
Yeah, they wouldn't always exist as a whole. If we're talking about like second law of thermodynamics and stuff like that. So since we're not on like an intermediate level of arguments for God's existence, I think it would be right for us to, instead of use something like de ente or a metaphysical proof, use St. Thomas's first argument from motion. Now, I have a certain syllogism for it here. That's why I don't know if you would like to give a different rendition of the argument. Would you care to break down the metaphysics of motion, and so that we can build up towards the argument that we're speaking about?
Yeah. So the argument that he's planning to give you is called the argument from motion, right? And we first have to understand what motion is. Basically, if you look at that tree right there, you can see the leaves moving. So the leaves are moving because it's contingent, right? It could possibly move to the left, possibly move to the right. But we're not just going to stop there, because we also have to understand why the trees move. The leaves move, sorry, not the trees, but the leaves move because it has the capacity to move to the left and the right. So for example, this is not moving to the left and the right because it doesn't have the capacity to. It has a stronger element. So there's something within the leaves and there's something within this that causes that to move and this not to move.
So you think the cause of things moving is within the things, not within the mover?
Well, technically speaking, the point
do you want to
is...
just like step to the left of it? Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Sorry, proceed.
Oh, okay, sorry. Yeah, so the fundamental point is...
So what moves things? Would it be the things, inanimate things, for example?
Yeah.
Rocks?
So
what moves them? Do they move themselves?
an inanimate thing can either be acted upon by something else, or it could have the active potency to move itself like we do. So for example, potentially my hand is to the right, and now actually my hand is to the right. That's an instance in which, in some sense, I have moved myself, but in another sense, there is a lead of like causal chains which has led me to do that, correct? So for things like things that receive their existence or receive their actuality, we're going to say they have something called passive potency. which means they have the potential for them as a subject to be edited by something else.
Yeah.
So, for example, that leaf over there, it has the potency to move from side to side, and that would be actualized by the wind blowing it. Correct?
Exactly. Yeah.
So what we mean by potency and actualization is just what I explained in the analogy earlier. I could potentially stop speaking, and now I've actually stopped speaking. And that's sort of an analogy for what we mean by active
Yeah, so
potency.
potential would be it has the ability to do it,
Yes.
but not necessarily does.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So then from there, we're going to distinguish between what we call a primary mover and a secondary mover. So a primary mover would be something that doesn't have any passive potency, which is the ability for something else to edit it, right? Or for it to receive its actuality.
Are there any examples of that in the physical world?
So we would say that a primary mover is just what we would call God, right? So either you have God, which is a primary mover.
So when you're coming up with this dichotomy of prime movers and non-prime movers, how do you get that dichotomy first? How do you establish that?
the dichotomy,
Yeah.
the dichotomy would just exist from possibilities, right? So you might say, oh, I don't believe that a primary mover could exist. That's just the very nature of the argument we're arguing towards. Obviously, secondary movers exist.
So we can hypothesize that there's a prime mover, and you can go on from there and see how everything could be created from that. That's nice, but we still need to establish how the prime mover got there, if it got there, where it comes from.
Yeah.
And all of this.
So
I think it's like
sorry.
It's something called it's an a posteriori argument.
Yeah.
So it's like from the ground up. So for example, like if water spills on the floor, I can assume that or if there's just water on the floor, especially like on the roads and everything, I can assume that it's rain. I can assume that it's someone splashed the water, whatever. Now, if there's no one around the water, then it's more likely that it's going to be rain, especially if the clouds are dark. You can reason from different effects to what happened.
So you're saying that this creation shows implications that there was a creator. Is that what you're saying?
The difference here is that in this example that I brought, it obviously shows implications. In this example that I brought, it obviously shows implications.
Yeah.
But with this argument, it shows that there's no other theoretical implication that could be implied.
So according to you, is the universe created?
Yeah, because so
this
when
is a creation, and if we start off with those terms, I'll automatically have to admit that there are being creator. But I'm not going to call it a creation. I'm just going to call it a universe because I don't know if it's created. But you're going to say that.
I think in order to carry less baggage in the term, how about we call it an effect rather than a creation?
But that's still implying that it was caused by something.
Yes.
But I'm not going to
But there's certain reasons as to why we would say it's caused, and why it would come under something we call the principle of sufficient reason. That every contingent thing has a sufficient explanation for its existence. So, for example, the universe is composed of parts, right? So everything here you see, if we take the universe to be the set of contingent things, the universe is composed of parts. Something which is composed of parts would be caused by something else.
Why is that?
Well, because the parts would depend on the whole.
Could they not arrange themselves?
No, because go ahead.
There's between every part and the whole, there's a dependency relation automatically from the nature of what a part and a whole is. For example, a pepperoni.
Well, I know we're going to give that definition, but there's ways that we come up with definitions for things and answers for things like that. But you have to account for why parts of things can't arrange themselves together by themselves. Because I can see in the physical world that does happen when things of the same nature come together automatically by themselves, by nature, and it's got nothing to do with other things moving them or God moving.
In any physical example that you bring where things of parts are coming together to be arranged by themselves, that arrangement is enacted by some other conditions.
So the environment.
Yeah, not just the environment. For example, an electron, right, moving on the orbital spin of an atom. Now, obviously, someone can assume that the electron came together with the formation of the atom. But that's obviously not true because the nucleus has weight that drags the electron down. So so the electron depends on the neutron, right?
Depends on, I would say, so an atom, for example, is dependent on its own function, what it can and can't do. So hydrogen has one molecule, it can only do things according to that nature. Same with helium, lithium, beryllium. All the elements have a certain nature to them, right?
Yeah.
So which makes them act the way they act. That's what science has discovered.
And all those, and in order for them to act,
Yeah.
they have to have certain conditions that allow them to act because they're dependent on those
yes,
conditions.
that would be the environment or what's around it causing it to do that. If it's not being caused by itself, then it will be the environment that assists it to cause that.
Yeah, and the point is that they can never be caused by themselves because fundamentally, by their very nature, they're dependent on other conditions.
Yeah, but it's
So
it's dependent on something physical surrounding.
Well, it would be counterfactually dependent, right? So if a thing which is composed could just cause itself, the thing would depend on its parts, while simultaneously the parts depending on the thing. This would be a metaphysical circle. This wouldn't be possible.
Yeah.
What do you mean? So a thing depending on, so a thing's got parts. You're saying that those parts don't rely on each other to be as a whole, but they rely on something else.
Well, the parts can rely on each other, right? But if you have a whole subject, and the whole subject relies on its parts for it to exist in the way it exists, but the parts also depend on inhering in the subject, that would mean that the subject is counterfactually dependent in that parts depend on the whole and the whole depends on the parts. Problem with that is it's metaphysically circular. It's not something that is metaphysically possible.
Unfortunately, that's how you have to explain the universe, is that it's circular, because that's how things recycle and come back into existence and go again. And it's like a constant cycle of atoms just shifting and moving together. And you can say what causes that is a God. We've got no proof for that, but we do know that by the behaviour of things, we can see that the internal structure of atoms is what influences how they act. Not necessarily 100% determines them, but it influences it.
I don't really think that's true though, because for example, right? In your view, I don't want to get too physical. I study quantum physics, but in your view, right? So let's just take the physic idea of matter, right? Anything that has weight and occupies space. But there's different types of atoms, there's different types of material. I'm sure you're aware of, neutrinos and all these other particles. But all these things form because of different conditions. If someone snapped their finger again and did the universe again, they might be all different. The particles might be all different. And we obviously know from the observation of the Big Bang with the Hubble telescope and the radiation that, the universe had a...
The theory of the Big Bang?
Yeah, the universe had an expansion at least. We can agree that the universe expands at least.
Is that agreed upon by all science? That do you mean it's constantly expanding or it's just expanded?
No, I'm just saying it's just expanded.
Okay.
Yeah. So the fact that it's expanded means, and it goes back to the argument for motion. It had a capacity to expand, and then it expanded. But it didn't expand.
Sorry to interrupt you, because there are scientific theories that say that the universe is not just expanding, but it's going to contract again. So it does a contraction and expansion.
I think Alexander Vilenkin had a paper against this, and he said that the reason why this theory would be implausible is because if the universe could expand and then retract constantly, it would make the initial constants of it completely unstable, and thus it wouldn't be able to do that. I think it's called the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theory that you can read a paper on.
I'd have to have a look at it, because...
Is there a German-Dutch paper or something?
I can pull up the quote for you now if you would like, from Alexander Vilenkin.
Yeah, so since there are counteracting theories to what's going on there in terms of the universe expanding or shrinking, what entropy if it's running out, and all that, there's arguments for all of those things, and I'm not educated on all of those arguments to be able to just accept your position or reject it, but I can hear your theories on it.
I would... go ahead.
No, go on.
So I would say that let's try to pivot back towards the actual syllogism here, because I think the syllogistic form of the argument can bypass a lot of these objections, because all that the argument's trying to establish is that what we call the primary mover exists.
So you can do that through logic?
Yes, I think that we can do it through metaphysical logic. So, for example, we've already established a primary mover is a possibility. We've not established if it exists or not yet, but it's a possibility. Also, something which is a possibility is a secondary mover, right? Something which receives...
possibly a secondary mover.
Yeah. So something which receives its actuality from another, it has passive potency. Now, that would be premise 2 of the argument. I'll pull up the syllogism here. So it's either when we point to a thing in the world that's in motion or something like that, it's either going to be a primary mover or a secondary mover. And there's either at least one primary mover, or there is at least one secondary mover, or multiple. Now, if something were a secondary mover, there would have to be either an infinite regress of secondary movers, a brute contingency, which is just a secondary mover which just exists for no sufficient reason, or there is a primary mover, right? These are these are the three
see,
options.
if there is a prime mover, it's a bit of a it's not a diversion at all. Actually,
Yeah.
it's actually on play. So, would you say that the prime mover exists?
Yes.
Did the prime mover create everything that exists?
Yes, in a certain sense, yes.
So, logically, because we're going to go on logic, according to that, the prime mover self-created.
So the prime mover, okay, so when I say the prime mover
do you get how
created,
that comes?
yeah, when we're saying the prime mover created everything that exists, I'm more referring to the contingent things which
Okay,
exist.
so we have to change
right?
the definition then. So the prime mover didn't create everything that existed.
The prime mover obviously didn't create itself. The prime mover is a necessary existence,
Yeah,
right?
it's just the definition
Meaning that,
of it, because
yeah,
when we start off with these definitions, we have to go on them
clarify.
completely.
Yes.
Yeah. So if we say the prime mover created everything that exists, that's a contradiction. We know it because it can't create itself.
Yes.
So we have to admit that the prime mover did not create all things that exist.
Yeah.
That
The
has to be
reason
admitted.
why the prime mover didn't create itself is primarily because what a prime mover is, right?
So it
It's,
didn't create
and
all
I'll let
things.
you go in after this as well.
Yeah.
I know you want to speak. Because a prime mover is pure actuality, correct? And if it's pure actuality, it doesn't receive any potency for existence because it is identical to its own existence.
So it can't exist then.
No, because it's identical to its own existence.
But I mean, if we're going to go on the logic, if this then that must be true, yeah. So if the the unmover, which is the creative existence, right?
Mm-hmm.
If he created all things in existence, and he exists or it exists, therefore we can't deny this logic. It
Well,
has to have
we would
created
say it
itself.
has a different mode of existence than other things.
Yeah,
It would
so-
be ipsum esse subsistens, which means it's pure subsistence
Yeah, yeah.
existence
Even
itself.
even if it had a different mode of existence, it still exists. It's still a part of.
Yeah,
and
but
it's
we're
part of
obviously,
existence.
when we say that the creator created everything that exists, it's obviously a prefaced phrase to designate contingent things, what we mean by
So
that.
we have to say it more clearly then.
Yeah,
I'm
more
allowed
clearly.
to say that
Yeah.
the prime mover didn't create all things that exist.
I know you want to go
I'm
ahead.
allowed
Well,
to say that, right?
we're talking about the argument from motion. So we're talking about
I know, 'cause
things.
I'm going before that. So the logic to establish
Yeah.
how a creator could even be there for us all.
But the reason why I'm trying to tell you that was coming from the argument from motion is because if you understand that we're arguing for a prime mover that moves everything,
Yeah.
the prime mover himself is not moved.
See, what he did is, what you done was you gave me 3 options of what must be the case. It either is a prime mover, there's a secondary mover, or
The 3 options
Third one.
wasn't that. So I'm
Okay,
saying
so-
if we pick out a thing in reality, right, and let's say the thing is a secondary mover, because obviously if the thing we pick out is a primary mover, then we've just established the conclusion of the argument. But if the thing is a secondary mover, then either we have an infinite regression of causes of secondary movers, we could have a brutally contingent secondary mover, which just means that the thing doesn't have a sufficient reason for its existence. It's a violation of what we call the PSR, or what we have is a primary mover necessary existence.
so from there you're given the options. From if there is a prime mover,
And you're
these
more
are
than
the-
welcome to try to hypothesize more options than that,
Yeah.
but those are just the options from the philosophical literature that are usually discussed.
Yeah, I get that. It's just that I find more difficulty with that than using logic that I just said. So my logic makes a lot more sense to me personally. That's why I'm going to go with it than to pick an option or to assume something. So I know logically it does not make sense to admit that if the prime mover created all things in existence, that he also exists. He can't exist.
Well, but
Or he
I
didn't
think,
create all things.
again, to be fair, the phrase has to be prefaced.
That's what I mean. It has to be very clear. So when you're saying that Allah, oh, sorry, not Allah, God created all things that exist, and He exists, that means therefore logically you cannot deny this.
Well,
that he created
we
himself. But if you-
technically,
but if
as
you-
Thomists,
sorry.
wouldn't say God exists in this sense. We would say God is pure,
Subsists.
yeah, God subsists, right? Because God isn't what we would call in a genus.
God
So
exists.
God exists in a different mode of existence, in
So
that
he
he
exists.
is pure subsistence itself. Because if you think of existence as a genus which different things are participating in, God isn't like a universal or a particular which is participating in genuses, right? So for example, the genus of humanity is something that we participate in because we instantiate
Yeah, I'm
it.
just trying to help
Yeah.
this. I want to make it work. So how can I define God, the prime mover, as something and it not be a contradiction? So I can say that God exists, the creator exists. We call him God, yeah?
Yep.
God exists. I have to go from there. He created all things in existence, all modes of existence apart from his own. This is the
No,
definition.
no, no. Let's just use the phrase, God exists and he creates all things that are contingent. God is the only necessary being.
So he didn't create all things that existed.
Because obviously,
You have to say that, yeah.
if you're stuck on this phrase, the fundamental issue is that we're talking about contingent things and we're arguing that the universe is contingent and God is a necessary being.
Yeah,
that's
but-
how
if we go-
metaphysics
If we
works.
go from there, I'll have to admit what you say, but I'm not going
Yeah.
from there because I'm not going to admit that God is a necessary being yet. I'm going to first establish the logic on it.
Well, we're
if it makes
doing
sense.
a conceptual analysis, right? So when we conduct conceptual analysis, we're not starting off with the thing that we're analysing is false. We're starting off with, if it is true,
Yes.
what can we conceptually analyse
Exactly.
about it? And
That's
what
what
you're
I'm trying
trying
to
to
do.
do right now is a conceptual analysis on God, where we're saying, assume God
It's a
exists.
logical one. I know it's conceptual.
So we're saying, assume God exists, then what can we know about
Yes,
God from
that's
that
right.
assumption?
Yeah.
So if we're assuming God exists, then the theistic presuppositions about God is what's going to have to be attacked rather than something that they don't hold to.
I don't need to. Sorry, I don't need to be rude there. But I don't think I need to go to religious systems to attack your position, your logical position. If your logical position don't go on to a correct conclusion or it's a contradiction, I'm allowed to point that out just in itself without saying from any religious background or attacking any.
But
I'm not even
I
saying
think
about
the problem is, though, the contradiction isn't actually what's taken from the perspective of the God that we're providing it. Now, if someone was to say that statement that you said earlier unprefaced, then perhaps that would be a valid critique.
Yeah.
But since we're not agreeing with the statement in the way that you're saying it, then it wouldn't be a conceptual analysis of God in itself, but just sort of a particular conception of God, which we can agree with you wouldn't be the correct conception.
I don't understand what you fully meant there. Are you saying that logic don't work with understanding God, basically?
No, logic of course works with understanding God, but you're trying to give a particular phrase. God created everything.
No, I'm asking
Now,
you,
yeah.
because I want a definition of God, basically.
Yeah, we would just say God is the necessary being.
Okay, so you don't say things like, because I'm trying to establish what you say. You don't say he is the creator of existence,
We think he is the
Things-
creator of the genus of existence.
but not all things in existence, right?
So when we say God exists, we're not saying he's contained in the genus existence, because if God were contained in a genus, he would be contingent himself.
I don't know what genus, I'm not saying he's a genus particular or anything
Yeah.
like that. I'm just saying, from what you've said, so God exists, right? The second premise, God create. If you're saying this, which I don't think you are saying this,
Yep.
the second premise, if that is God created everything that exists, there's an equal sign after that that leads to a conclusion,
So-
which is that it must have been self-created.
Yeah.
Because he exists and created everything that
For
exists.
the sake of the conversation,
Okay, yeah.
we'll say that we disagree with that statement, because I think there's further nuance into what we mean when we say the
know
statement
there's-
God
yeah.
exists.
I know
Because
people
when
have-
he says God creates everything that exists, you have to ask, okay, why? Why is it that God creates everything that exists? And then obviously the distinction is going to be that, okay, because God is a necessary being, and we have to, first off, we have to prove
That's what
that
I mean, we're trying to
everything.
do that first so that I can prove my logic
Yeah.
wrong. But
So-
it's
so
better
we-
to stay
yeah.
with the logic that makes sense than to find ways around proving it wrong. That's what I would rather not do. If the logic is the logic and it makes sense, because if I'd abandon that, my whole logical reasoning has to go out the window.
But okay, but I thought we've
So
already.
we've got to
yeah.
establish the definition of what a God is. That's what I'm asking.
No, he said necessary being. When I
So
said
it's not,
true,
it's not the creator of all things then. That's cool. If you want to
He
say
is
that
the-
of all things in existence, that exists.
I think a definition of a thing doesn't have to include every single predicate
yeah.
that can be assigned to a thing.
No, it does.
So when I say the definition of man is
Yeah.
a rational animal,
Yes.
I don't also have to say men have two limbs, two arms
you do.
and
That's
two legs.
No, that's a differentiator of a human. So a human differs from an animal in terms of its physiology. That would be if it's differentiate.
But you
can
don't-
explain it through its differentiate, how it differentiates, or you can explain it from its what's the opposite to genus? No,
Particulars?
yeah, genus. Yeah, not speed. You can define things according to its genus or according to its differentiate. And by me saying that a human being has these attributes, is determining its differentiate from other things. This is
Yeah, all
I think-
I'm,
yeah.
yeah, go ahead.
I think you have a good point. But the point is like when we give real definitions on things. So look,
that's how it's done.
a definition is what is this thing,
Yeah.
right? What is water? So
You have to compare it with something else to give its intrinsic definition. You can't say that water is something without using other words or using other things.
yeah, but for example, in the definition of a cat, for example,
Yeah.
you literally cannot define a cat.
You can.
No, let me finish.
Sorry.
first. You cannot define a cat by saying, look, a cat is you cannot define a cat with all its intricate details by saying, look, a
get what
cat
you're
is a
It's only
feline
referring-
animal
yeah, it's
with
only-
this
Those
and
are
that.
descriptors.
The reason-
that's
yeah.
not a
No, I get
definition.
what you're
The
saying,
reason why is because look, okay, so for example, you said,
Wait, let me
look, if you define a human being as a rational animal with two legs and two arms or whatever, there are human beings
That's right, you're right, you're
that
I get your point.
exist
I
with
get your
with
point.
only one leg.
Yeah,
So
good
so you can explain that a human being often has two legs, but the definition doesn't capture just the differentiate.
but
No, the
logical
definition.
basis, if I say that a human being is a rational animal,
Yeah.
I am a human being, therefore I am a rational animal. This is giving,
Right.
this is giving logic about me properly.
So now we're
speaking.
talking about the logic part.
Yes,
so
that's what I'm saying. Yeah. I have to go with my definition first. So my definition is a human being. According to that, I have these attributes and characteristics which are fixed to my definition.
yeah.
That's
So
what I'm saying about your definition of God. If you give that definition of God, there's going to be fixed attributes to that. So Allah, sorry to say Allah. Allah is God is the creator of all things in existence. If that's the definition you're assigning to God, there's going to be attributes to that, and that we can go from
But
logically.
attributes would more be sort
When
of
I
like
say attributes, I don't mean physical bodily attributes. I mean attributes.
yeah,
in the
as
definition.
metaphysical
Yeah.
attributes, yeah. So attributes, or how we say things about God, would more sort of flow from a conceptual analysis from what God is, and then saying, okay, if we think hard enough about what a necessary being is, we can know, okay, a necessary being must be immaterial, atemporal, etc. Those would be attributes, but the point isn't that with a definition we have to give every single descriptor for what we're talking about.
Because that's what
but-
leads us into traps if you don't.
Well, no. But okay, so for example, with the cat, we don't have to say the cat has a cat is something which has a tail,
But I could
two
talk about
legs,
the cat.
two
So
things.
if he's asking me what a cat is, I can say to him, it is. I can go from substance, go down the tree, the Porphyrian tree. I'm sure you know.
but that's not defining the
No,
cat,
no,
We're,
right?
we're talking
No,
just
I'm saying I
about
can give you
the
that as a
what
definition
is the
for it.
definition
I
of
know. I can give you the definition in that way and say that a cat is a feline animal which differs from the sophisticated human. Yeah, that's one way. It's differentiating its genus. Or I can, but that's not what I'm trying to do. You're trying to tell me the definition of God, right? And now I'm going on the attributes of it. If you've given me the definition of cat, right, I'm going to say, right, if a cat does this, must it therefore do that, right? And you're going to say, yeah, these are the logical steps from that definition you've given me.
Okay, so why can't
I'm doing
okay?
the same thing with
yeah.
God. You've given the definition of God. I assume you've given the definition of God that He is the creator of all things in existence. right?
Okay, so why can't we just distinguish? Look, why can't we just okay? If you want to be so intricate, you could say God is the creator
Yeah.
of all things in secondary
That's
existence.
fine. You can do that. But, if
But then
have
would
to
you-
change the definition from that to that now? That's
Okay,
fine.
because
I'm happy
when
to
you
work with that
yeah.
definition. I don't think that's
Yeah.
what we
As long as
necessarily
it don't
have to
upset-
hold
'cause
to,
it
but
upsets
we can
some
hold.
religions to say that God or Allah is the creator of everything in existence. He exists. but they want to deny that he is one of his own creations, because that is the logical step. But if you're willing to do that and you say that
Because-
either Allah is not the creator of all existence, or he doesn't exist, one of those two positions you have to take.
The point, okay, you're making you're making a biological statement. You're saying it's this or that. The point is that
It's the only way the logic can go, though. If you say that,
But the point-
it is
but the-
something, I'm going off of that.
But to establish that, we have to understand what he means by existence. So look,
Yeah.
here's the thing. Existence, as it's typically defined by the scholastics, is an act that pushes something outside of its causes. So this tree exists, but the cause of the tree was the seed, and there's an act that pushes the tree outside of the seed, and the tree now exists as a tree. So that's existence.
I don't know. That's an example of an existence. Yeah.
That's what existence is an act that pushes something outside of its causes and makes it an effect. But here's the point.
I'll read the definition. It's an act of formality that constitutes a thing outside of its causes and
outside the state of nothing. Yeah.
Okay.
So the point is this: when we say God exists, we're saying he exists analogically. We're saying, look, he is in act, but it's not as if he was purported outside of its causes and outside the state of nothing. He subsists. So he doesn't want to say that God subsists. He doesn't have to explain the whole. He's just trying to say, look, God creates all things that exist. But now that he's clarified the notion of existence, or if you want to disagree, you can just say, look, God is the creator of all things that are in secondary existence. And now if we can move on from that and get to the topic.
Yeah. But you can't see this as a trivial thing. It's very important to clarify the concepts that you're saying, because this is what I've had problems with all my life here, is that people saying to me to admit options to things and going on from there, and then all of a sudden I've got to either take shahada or get baptized. That's why I'd rather get these definitions laid out so that we don't missay anything, because later on, if you turn around and say, yeah, but we admitted God created everything in existence, we didn't. You know what I'm saying? We just got to make sure that this is all.
Well, now we've clarified the terminology. Should we proceed forward in the argument? So the next stage of the argument.
That was secondary in existence, basically. That's what.
Yeah. So where we are at in the argument right now is we're saying, okay, we either have primary movers or secondary movers.
Yeah.
Let's just forget the primary mover for now, because obviously if we say a given thing is a primary mover, we're admitting that exists, and then the conclusion of the argument follows. That's what we're arguing for. So then we will just take, okay, we have secondary movers. Now,
before we carry on, do you want to make this conversation firmly established, as firmly as you can establish it, basically, or do you want to just go from sort of later steps and cut out a lot of metaphysics?
I think that I think it would probably be most fruitful for us to just probably cut out the steps that come after this and reserve that for a later conversation, so this doesn't extend on too long, but focus probably more on the steps of this particular argument here.
Right.
Yeah?
Okay, yeah, because I mean, I'm not gonna, if it goes back to something that that we didn't discuss, then I'm gonna have to go back to that. And
yeah, if you have like criticisms of any of the premises, the conclusion, any of the metaphysical buttressing, go ahead and we will discuss those. Yeah? So the next part of the argument is that we're analysing a secondary mover, and we're saying, okay, the causal history of any secondary mover must be finite. And because that must be finite, it would imply that a primary mover must exist. Because definitionally, a secondary mover receives its existence or its actuality from something else. It's the definition of a secondary mover, right? So the reason why, a scholastic would explain it by saying the reason why the chain cannot go backwards infinitely of secondary causes is because of something called per se causal series. However, I think that what we could do is approach it from a more analytical perspective with paradoxes which sort of show that an infinite regress of causal series cannot be true. So, have you heard of a philosopher called Alexander Proust? So, he gives this paradox, right? He says, imagine a world in which you have an infinite number of paper parcels, an infinite number of messengers, right? So messenger number 1 would be like assigned to January 1st, 2024. Messenger number 2, January 1st, 2023. And messenger number 3, January 1st, 2022. And they go backwards into the past ad infinitum. And each messenger has the task of, if they pass on, they have to pass on a piece of paper to the next messenger. If as a messenger you receive a piece of paper and it is blank, then you must write your natural number on the paper. However, if the paper is not blank, you don't write anything and you just pass it on. Now, the paradox comes where Proust says that the contradiction that this leads to is that there is a number wrote on this piece of paper, however, no number is wrote on the piece of paper. And the reason why is because for any messenger we can point out in this series, a previous messenger could have always wrote their number on the paper. So if I say it was messenger number 1000, well, number 1001 could have wrote their number. And the same can be said of any messenger. And the point here is that if the causal history of a thing could be infinite, this scenario would at least be modally possible due to something called the recombination principle. So what Proust is trying to say here is that this would lead to the possibility of a contradiction if we were to say that the causal history of secondary movers could be infinite.
If I'm honest with you, I didn't understand his example of how that proves that. But we can go on from that because I don't want to. I don't mind accepting.
Yeah, I mean, I can explain it further for you because I think it might be a bit valuable.
Yeah.
So the point of the analogy is, so actually repeat to me what you got from what I said, and then I'll try to.
Everybody has got to pass a message on to each other, and everyone's got to write down their number on that piece of paper. I'm assuming it's the number, the order that they're in.
Yep.
And when it gets to number 1000, something happens there, but I don't know.
Oh, okay, yeah. So there's an infinite number of messengers spread to the past, right? So messenger number 1, we'd say that could be January 1st, 2024.
So basically, I think I know what you're saying.
Yeah.
Because numbers, it will go on like pi, basically.
It would go on infinitely into the past, but the contradiction comes here because each messenger has the task of when they receive a piece of paper from a message that's been passed. Yeah. And I'll let you give the scholastic breakdown of per se causal series as well, because that might be more of a that might be more your forte when using this argument. I'm not taking the traditional approach that St. Thomas takes.
Don't worry about it. I'll just get off you guys. Yeah, I've got the chop. Yeah, do you want to mind plugging that in? Sorry.
Yeah. So I'm not taking the traditional approach to this argument. I'm sort of mixing it in with some analytical notions of philosophy. But basically, the point of this argument is that if there is an infinite number of messengers in the past, and they have this task where when they receive the message, if it's blank, write their number on it. If it's not, then don't write anything on it and just pass it to the next person.
Yeah, no, I agree that there would be no...
There would be no
number.
messenger in the... Well, the problem is there has to be a number in the chain because they have a task of writing it. But the problem is none of the messengers wrote the number. So it would be a contradiction. Right? Because consider
how
this.
That proves that things can't go back.
So here's the reason why, right? Because in philosophy we have something known as modality, right? Gottfried Leibniz wrote about this. I'm not sure if you're familiar with some of his work, but basically it's the way in which the world possibly could have been. Right? And what we're utilizing is something called a recombination principle, which just means if we accept certain axioms about reality, reality could have possibly have been another reconstructed way. And what Proust is saying is, if causal finitism is false, if it's true that the causal history of a thing could go back infinitely, then this scenario would be possible because of this thing called the recombination principle.
It wouldn't be possible though.
That's the point. Yeah. So if causal finitism...
I don't get how this... I still don't get it.
So the point is, right, the way to solve the analogy is that it's impossible that there could be an infinite regress of these messengers.
I don't see how that's not possible that there could be an infinite regress. I know of messengers, yeah. Because if there was... Because I'm saying that there's... I'm not saying this, but leaving that as an option, that the universe didn't have a beginning, that it's been constantly going and going and going. So if that is the case, your analogy about messengers from the beginning can't happen, because there can't be I know that there can't be no messenger at the beginning because there's no beginning, therefore there wouldn't even be a number, let alone being able to pass on the message.
So the point is,
it's like me positing some hypothetical universe that can't accommodate something, and then saying that's why
So-
that can't be.
So the point is, right,
Do you know what I mean?
when we accept certain axioms about how the world could be, what philosophers try to do with this recombination principle is they say, okay, if that's true, then the world could have possibly have been this way. And if it's impossible that the world could be a way in which it could be if we accept certain principles, there's something wrong with the principles that we've just accepted, which is the point of this argument from Proust. But I don't know if you want to go into like per se causal series or not on this.
I can if you want.
Okay.
Well,
Do you want to like just so the camera can see everything?
Okay. So, a per se cause is. Well,
This, by the way, is a different approach to proving that the causal history of things are
Per se means
are
like
finite.
per
Yeah.
se is in it's supposed to be there. It should be there. kind
Yeah.
of thing,
Just to give you clarification for what he's arguing. He's arguing for the same conclusion that I just made, but just from a different tradition.
Right. So, we have per se causes and per accident causes.
What's the second one?
So, per accidents.
Per accident, yeah. I know.
It's kind of like
Yeah.
accident, but
Yeah.
it's NS. So,
Is this Immanuel Kant?
no,
It's
it's
St. Thomas Aquinas,
Thomas Aquinas and-
Aristotelian metaphysics, scholastics.
Yeah. Sorry, I just want to get a background on it.
yeah. So basically, a per se cause is more so like a direct cause, in which the power of the cause is within the cause itself. So, for example, like if I slap the camera and the camera falls on the ground, that's a per se cause. I use my power to slap the camera and the camera fell on the ground. That's an effect. A per accident cause is kind of like a cause by influence. So,
So an accident, let me just say, so you can see if I'm right about it. So an accident is something that doesn't necessarily belong to a thing, but it's just there. Like, what's necessary to me is that I have limbs and arms. It's not necessary that I have this jumper.
Yeah.
So this is an accident.
It's kind of
Is that
like
what it is,
per accidens causal series. Each of the members in the series have the causality of the series in of themselves,
Yeah.
right? So, for example, if we think of a chain of people begetting other people, begetting just meaning they have offspring, right? So, for example, if I have a child called John, and my child John has a child called Mary, do I have to still be alive for John to reproduce to make Mary? So that would be an example of a per accidens causal series. Meanwhile, a per se causal series would be something like if I swing a stick that hits a
gonna
stone.
happen, yeah,
Like,
yeah.
for example, when we play golf, right? I swing a stick and it hits a stone. Well, if I swing the stick doesn't have the causality in itself to hit the stone in this series. And the stone doesn't have the causality in itself to move in this series. So they're reliant upon a primary cause, which is the first member of the series. So I'm sorry to
Exactly.
interrupt,
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
just to give analogies.
Yeah.
It's good
That's
that
the
I'm
perfect
understanding
example.
where you're coming from, because per se and accidents are in themselves, without just putting cause after them,
Yeah.
they mean what belongs to the thing and what not necessarily belongs
Yeah,
to the
in
thing.
the per se causal series, the things receive their causality per aliud in Latin, just through it from another, right? And in the per accidens, the things have the causality in themselves.
Yeah, okay.
Yep.
Yeah. Essentially, the per accident causes could hypothetically be infinite, right? So, for example, like if I send my son to school and I say do well in school, and he does well in school, he is per se the cause for doing well, but I am per accident because I have influence on my son. So my son could get, an infinite amount of influence,
It's easy
right?
if we just say cause and secondary cause. I kind of know what you mean. So
Well, it's
something
not-
that directly caused it, something that indirectly caused it.
You could have a primary per accident cause. You can have but the fundamental point is that the per accident causes could go on infinitely,
Yeah, right.
but they all suppose a per se cause, and the per se causes are finite
Somebody doing it. Or,
because obviously the primary cause of all these per se causes is a cause that has the power within itself and is identical to that power.
Do you take analogy as a form of proof and evidence then, basically?
No,
No?
analogy is it's an explanation.
It's
Doesn't
a way
give
of
any.
explaining, yeah. So I don't think we can say that just because things happen, and this kind of cuts out a lot as well, just because things happen on this earth, I know it's an analogy for how things might happen in the divine, but if you prove that analogy is a good way of proving things, then I can accept that as very substantial. But
Yeah.
analogy to me when
is
we're talking
only
about, because when we're talking about divine stuff, and that, if logic's
Well,
going out
he's
the window,
not just giving you-
analogic
Yeah.
has to go out the window.
He's not just
Yeah.
giving you analogies, but
Yeah.
what he's doing is he's trying to present analogies to explain a point for you
Yeah,
to
I know that. I know,
receive it
yeah,
into
yeah.
your intellect.
I'm not using analogies to prove my point. I'm using metaphysical principles, and then I'm using analogies to
No,
explain
you
these
are.
principles.
Yeah, that's what I mean. You're giving me the metaphysical principles of how things work, and you're giving me the analogy. That's an analogy for how it must work in the divine.
No, I'm just saying, look. I'm just saying, look. I'm not saying that's how. I didn't even bring up the term divine. I'm just saying,
What
look.
are we saying?
No,
This
look.
stuff, this stuff about how the things work physically.
No, I'm just saying that everything that exists is a moved effect.
Yeah. As we see
yeah.
it here on Earth, but you're talking about something.
Not even just as we see it here on Earth, in the universe as well.
That's what I mean. As we know it physically, yeah, through physics, yeah.
So
We're
do you
talking about
agree with the
metaphysics,
Big
so
Bang at all? Sorry.
It's a theory, so I don't know.
Well, I don't really get it. So
This is where I always end up. When I get to a point where I don't want to accept opinions, people get annoyed with me.
I don't think the Big
I'm
Bang
not
you
getting annoyed
necessarily
with
have
you.
to accept.
I'm not getting annoyed with you. I just need a base because, for example, like,
You want to, like, I can agree with things we can prove through physics, yeah, and things we can prove through logic. That there's fine. We can do
Okay.
all of that. But if you're going to apply those physical things as an analogy to explain the divine, you know what I mean by that? The
Yeah,
other
I
world.
think the misunderstanding here is a per se and a per accidens causal series from
Yeah.
the scholastic perspective isn't only applicable to like a causal chain of physical objects, but it's also
also-
applicable to like even if we were to hypothetically say a chain of immaterial objects, right, causing each other, the chain would still be applicable there from this perspective.
and would you agree that metaphysics is a way of knowing things? For example, like, would you say that the principle of contradiction is true?
Yeah.
Right. But that's a metaphysical principle
Yeah.
because there's no way that this tree could be a tree and not a tree at the
we
same
know,
time.
We know that contradictions cannot subsist or be true either in the physical world or in the ideal world. So, for example, contradictions can't exist in the
So
physical world.
now, me and you both agree on something. So
I'm
now
not saying that just because that's when I say the ideal world, I'm talking about words, ideas, definitions, and stuff like that. That's what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about God.
yeah, I agree. I understand.
So I wouldn't say that just because I'm saying that both ideal things and physical things have no contradictions does not mean that I'm giving any analogy for how.
No,
it's
I'm
gonna
just
work in
I'm not even
the
talking about God. I'm
I'm
just saying
letting you know that. Yes.
I'm just saying, look, we have a principle, the principle of contradiction,
Yeah.
and now we agree on that principle. Now I can say, look, there's no way that tree is going to be that tree and not that tree at the same
Yes,
time, and you're
so-
going to agree.
Yeah.
That's an analogy, but
It's
that
not an
doesn't.
analogy.
No, me using the tree. I'm just saying, look, is it not me using the tree saying the tree is a tree is cannot be a tree and
It's not an
a tree at the
analogy,
same
no.
time? It's an
If you're-
example of the
if you're-
principle.
If you're pointing to a tree, then that tree can be classed as a representation or an analogy for
Well-
what you're saying. But if I'm talking about a tree, that's
Well,
there's no
generally,
analogy
generally
there. So I'm
when we're
talking about a
giving
tree,
like
the tree is this, the tree is that.
yeah,
That's not an analogy.
generally
I know,
when we're
I know,
giving
I'm not saying
proofs
that.
for things, we usually refer to other things to explain the evidence for that. So, for example, principle of non-contradiction. Well, in order to explain that, we might say, well, it's not true that a thing could exist and not exist at the same time. Well, notice that we're giving a reference to a thing, obviously without its sense being
Give an
there.
example of how that can be. I get that. Yeah,
Yeah.
You're giving me that analogy from the physical world. Yeah, that's fine.
So, but the analogy is physical, but the principle applies both
Yeah.
metaphysically and physically.
Yeah, it does. So, for example, God. I wouldn't say God can exist and not exist. That's why we went
Exactly.
through that logical reason.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
So just because you use physical analogies does not mean that we cannot use the principles and extend it to
No,
metaphysical
I get
things.
that, but I know what you're saying. I think
Yeah.
you're misunderstanding me. So by saying that, by using the examples of things on Earth and applying those examples to say that's how it must be on Earth, that is something I disagree with. If you're saying we found logic on Earth and we want to use that to the divine, that's acceptable. But to say we're using logic on Earth to discover how that tree works, that logic about that tree can therefore apply to heaven. That I disagree with.
But-
you get what I'm saying?
I mean,
Are you with me though?
I get what you're saying, but like metaphysics it covers being, it covers
Yeah.
everything that
No,
exists.
physics is one thing, which discusses physical things, like Aristotle done metaphysics and physics. And the metaphysics discusses logic, meanings to things. So you've
Well,
got things as you see
metaphysics
them,
is
and
the
then-
study of being qua being.
Yeah. So being itself is not what you see in the physical world. Would you agree with that? Yeah? Being. You don't see being.
I
You
mean,
see physical substance, but you don't see being. Being and substance to Aristotle
Yeah, I
have
don't-
a
yeah.
similarity, but they're not the same thing.
yeah. I think the point is like, look, if metaphysics is a study, right? Because you said metaphysics is a study
Meta
of
above physics, so beyond physics.
yeah. So it's a study of being, right?
Yes, yeah.
That's what metaphysics
Study
is.
no, the study of being is ontology.
No,
Ontology is an
ontology-
aspect of
Metaphysics is a study of being qua being.
Being, yeah.
Ontology is a study
of being,
Which
in this,
I guess in a sense, ontology comes under the branch of metaphysics.
Metaphysics.
Yeah, so metaphysics would be the study of things generally, what they are and what they mean. But ontology is the study of only being in itself, what that is. Is that what
Well,
you said?
ontology is the study of being in their categories and the structure of being, whereas metaphysics is the study of the quality of being and what being is and why being is, why there's something rather than nothing, things like that. So
I'm just going to
yeah,
look it up just to make sure that I've
Yeah.
got the right definition.
I mean, this
of
is coming from
metaphysics.
a scholastic and Aristotelian
Scott-
understanding
scholastic manual.
of what
Yeah,
metaphysics
mine
is. Like,
Aristotelian.
so, for example, if you read Henry Grenier in his book, I think volume 3, Metaphysics, for Henry Grenier.
volume 3, I think.
Yeah, I think volume 3. In his book, when he discusses being, he will define metaphysics as being qua being.
Oh, fair enough,
Study of
yeah,
being
yeah.
qua being.
So when you say being qua being, what does that mean? Being in itself?
Being as being, yeah.
Yeah.
Qua means as. But look, I think
Nature of,
yeah.
you're kind of right. So in classical Greek philosophy, metaphysics refers to the branch of philosophy that deals with the nature of reality, existence, and the fundamental structure of the world beyond the physical. So this is what I was trying to say. I know you're saying metaphysics is being qua being. It's not just that. It's the study of everything apart from physics. So
Well, I think metaphysics is obviously applicable to physical
To
things,
physics,
right?
yeah.
no, they,
Like,
they assist each other, but they're not the same subjects. So
Well,
you need
for
physics
example-
to have grounding for your metaphysics. So metaphysics will say things.
No, you
these
need.
things
It's
that-
the other way around because obviously
No, they're both- yeah,
metaphysics.
no, they're both around.
Physics is subordinate to metaphysics because obviously,
Yeah.
look, if I say that,
subordinate,
yeah,
but they
if-
need each other. So because I can't talk about things in metaphysics without having substantiated.
Yeah,
physics.
I think of the sciences, we would have to, as St. Thomas does, start with being, right? Because if we don't start with being, there's certain axioms about reality that we assume from metaphysics
Yeah, yeah.
that we couldn't obviously
right.
reason towards.
I
For
agree with
example,
you.
the principle of non-contradiction. When Descartes, for example, says, I think, therefore I am,
Yeah.
that can't be like the first principle of knowledge without there first being the principle of non-contradiction
non-contradiction.
and looking towards being first and then looking towards the cogito ergo sum.
But what about also the question? So why study these things in the first place is also a question. So because that is something that Aristotle dealt with in a book that's lost now called the Protrepticus, and he says that a person who wants to refute philosophy will have to use philosophy to
Exactly.
do it. Yeah.
yeah, against the sophists.
Yeah. But that is the kind of place where we need to start. Is how do we know that so it's kind of epistemology. How do you know that these subjects that we're using can actually define what we're saying, or how accurate are they in defining things? But if you're going to start with being, I can just ask you what is being then?
Well, you can't really define being because it doesn't
Yeah.
exist in a conceptual
You
category.
can give
Being
an
what it is.
you can, because the reason why you can't define being is because things with definitions are contained in being or a
that's-
genus,
for a
right?
thing to,
So
for anything that exists exists because of it has a being,
yeah,
right?
you can
That's the-
you can improperly define being,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
you can't give it the proper definition.
You can say, for example, like being is what a thing is.
Yeah,
being is the
improperly
essence.
you might say that.
Yeah. That is the best way I can say it though. Being is what a thing is.
Yeah. It's perfectly fine to
Anyway,
speak like that in normal
Yeah.
conversation, so long as we clarify it's not a proper definition, because
So-
then being would be under the genus being,
Yeah.
and then you'd have an infinite
you
regress
can't
of
have
being.
that. Yeah. I'm not digressing, by the way. I've got one more question.
Yeah.
About that. what does good mean? Not the moral sense, as in if you see something is good, what does that mean?
Well, good for in the Aristotelian view is going to be it's something called virtually distinct. So it's only going to be different in the mind from being.
Right.
So the reason
It's
why
be different from being, you said.
Only virtually,
yeah, only
as
virtually.
we think about it, right?
As we think about it.
Yeah.
So Aristotle would say that anything that exists is good.
Right.
The reason why is because obviously, it's typically how Aristotle does philosophy. He looks at something and then he questions what it is and what makes it what it is.
Causes of things,
Yeah.
So what makes goodness good is the fact that it is not imperfect.
Are there some things
Or-
that are more good than others?
Yeah,
Yeah,
or-
like for example, a heart that functions well, right? The heart, definitionally, the essence of a heart is the organ which pumps blood around the body. What makes a heart good is if it does that.
Does that
That's the final cause
So
of
are
the
you
heart.
saying that a thing is good when it does what it does?
a
well-
thing is good when it acts in accordance to its purpose.
Purpose. So when it is what it is.
Yeah, so like for
good is
yeah.
being.
Yeah,
Yeah.
in a sense.
But we just said good is separate and different from being.
No, he
No.
said it's virtually distinct from being. So,
Yeah.
Alright.
forgive us because the way in which Christians,
we have
yeah, the
problems.
way in which
Yeah.
Christians from a scholastic tradition speak is they will sometimes use terms which sometimes we'll think other people know, but of course we don't have the same mind, so we might have to stop to explain it. So a virtual distinction would sort of be a distinction with a foundation in the actual thing, except the things that we're talking about don't lack identity in extramental reality, but we just perceive it to be that way in our intellect. For example, St. Thomas Aquinas is the same person as the angelic doctor of the church. However, you could think of them as virtually distinct because we may think of
They're
it
two
differently in our
paronyms
mind.
for the same word, you're saying. Or
Kind of.
synonyms for the same idea of it.
Yeah,
That's
kind
a
of.
synonym, yeah.
Kinda. I mean, look, like for example, concave and convex in a contact lens.
Right.
They're different in the mind, right? But the difference, in a way, is because of the contact lens, right? It's because I pushed it in and out.
Depending on, I know what you're saying, it's
But-
depending on the way you see it, yeah.
Yeah,
But-
it depends on the way you see
yeah,
it. Perfect.
That's what, yeah, it's off, it's finished, yeah. But convex, yeah, that's what defines a thing, is, so the definition of convex is when a thing appears like that. So if that's the definition of, I'm not saying it is, but if that was the definition of it, then it's all down to how you see it. So it's not, if you see it
Well,
that way,
no-
it means something, and if you see it that way, it's something else. When it's like that, that is its only definition.
I
When it's
see your
upside
point.
down,
I
it's
see your
another
point, but
definition.
I see your point, but that's not necessarily true because the definition of a convex is it depends on what
I
it
know,
is,
I'm
and
sure-
then
yeah, yeah.
and then look, it depends on what it is, and then once you see how it is according to what it is, then you call it convex. Although you might be wrong. So
No,
for
I
exa-
know, I
yeah.
agree with you. Yeah, I'm saying if that, I said to you that if the convex meant that it is how you, when the thing looks like that, then that means that the definition of a thing is determined by how it looks.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But
there's-
what he's
I know
basically
what he's
trying to
saying,
say
though.
is goodness and being in extramental reality beyond just how we think of it, are actually the same things. They
Yes.
don't have a real distinction.
Okay, so-
but the way we think about it, we think about them
I
differently.
know we have a moral
Yeah.
perspective. So if good and being are the same things, let me ask you this: is it better to do what is better than to do what is worse? Obviously, right? It's better to do what is better than to do what is worse. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, but I don't know where
It's
you.
relevant. I'm going.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
So, if it's better to do what is better than what is worse, and being is the best, it is better, it is good, that is the most good.
Pure
thing that
being,
there is,
pure being, yeah.
in itself. Then the answer to this is that it is best to seek being. The best thing you can do.
It's
the
best to
most good
seek,
thing you can do is find being.
Is the best thing you could do is to seek pure being, which
Yeah.
is necessary in itself
And it's- and
because
that's the statement
Which is?
itself says that.
which is God. Yeah.
Yeah,
Bang.
you can call it. Yeah. No, I agree. No, this is where you get how
There
you
you go.
click because
Yeah.
in my head we're commencing.
Yeah.
This is what I was
We're
trying to get
clicking
to.
together now.
We're trying to
Yeah.
establish why we should even do this. Because first of all, it is the best thing to do. Because you've established that being is the best, and it is better to do what is best than what is worst.
Yeah.
Therefore, it's better to seek being than what is not being.
Yeah.
That now establishes our conversation. That's where we should really start, from my perspective.
Okay.
Okay, that's awesome.
That's good.
So, do you want to go back to the per se
So now
causal
you're going to
series
say that
thing,
being is
or-
God. Now,
Yeah, that purely
if being
necessary
is God,
material
then I have
being.
do I have a God? That's the next contradiction I'd have to address.
But there's different degrees of being.
Okay, right.
So we're talking about a purely necessary being.
Right.
And that pure necessary being is not going to have any potency.
Is that purely necessary being itself?
Yeah.
So, and do I have a part of that being within me
No.
to be being?
No.
So where do I get my
Okay,
being
wait,
from?
we're doing so much equivocation. When you say being itself, you're
When
saying...
you say equivocation, do you mean I'm putting you two options that you just pick one? Is that what
No,
you mean?
no. Equivocation is when we're using a word, but in two premises of an argument, we're sort of using it differently. Like
get that,
if
yeah,
I said
yeah,
the
yeah.
dog barks and the tree has bark, the word bark is different there.
Okay, no, I'm not
I
doing
think
that, though.
he's saying that there is an equivocation on how we speak of God being pure being and how we speak of us as beings.
That's what
right?
I'm trying to understand.
So, yeah.
Where do I get my being from? Because that's life, right?
Yeah.
My existence. God is the pure form of that. To me, that I must have not got it from the pure source.
No, yeah, we say that God gave you your existence and your being.
Yeah.
Right.
But that being is not from Him. It's not His being.
You're not participating
yeah.
in his being, but you're participating in obviously
Being.
your mode of being.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
In your mode.
right, so
Because beings have there's different modes of being.
Yeah,
So there's the mode of being pure being, and there's the mode of being secondary being, and then there's the mode of being, inanimate being like rocks and stones and things like that.
I'm not sure how much longer you guys want to go.
Yeah,
Should we-
I'm getting a bit tired as well.
Okay, yeah.
But
So-
wait, can we say that was a good debate?
That was a very
that
good
was a good
discussion.
debate.
So
And we can continue that
yeah,
because we actually
we
ended on a
can
good
discuss it. We ended it discussing per se and per accidens causal series, and if the causal history of secondary movers can be finite. Just to
We finished with the beginning actually.
Yeah, we finished at the beginning. We sort of worked our way back,
yeah.
but I think it was a very productive discussion. Hopefully,
Yeah,
we'll
it
have
was.
more. And I think just to clarify for the audience, because we obviously didn't say the full syllogism of the argument. So at this point in the video, they may be thinking, where on earth are you going with secondary causes and primary? The point is that if the proofs in which we gave to you do follow through, that secondary movers must terminate in a primary mover, then a primary mover which we call God would exist. So that is the conclusion of the argument that we're trying to get to. And a primary mover, again, what we mean by that is something which is pure actuality, pure being, right? And then from there we can discuss what attributes of a primary mover there might be, whether it's perfect,
we can say-
stuff like that.
We can say
Exactly.
it's a purely necessary being, and it is pure act, and by virtue of it being a purely necessary being, for one, it can't be material, because material things are composed of act and potency, and the composite.
Or temporal.
Or temporal. We don't want to say that about this being. So it's immaterial, right? It's a negation of material, so it's immaterial. Now, not only is it immaterial, but it's immaterial and its being is the way it exists. That's why it's necessary. It's always existed and it's always been the way that it's been. You came to be, grew up as a 1-year-old, 2-year-old, 3-year-old,
Is that full?
5-year-old, 6-year-old, from teenager. God has always been and existed that way. That's what we call purus actus purus in Latin. Pure act.
Hopefully next time we can get to prove that.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So with that being said, I think this has been a very fruitful
yeah,
discussion.
definitely.
We need more discussions like this at Speaker's
I hope
Corner,
so, I hope
because
so.
usually it's just interruptions and we're not actually building towards something.
that's right.
But here, I think we've had a productive conversation. So it's been a pleasure talking to you, James.
Well done.
I'm
pleasure
going to
talking
come
to
back
you.
next week and we'll hopefully continue.
God willing.
Yeah.
Okay.
God willing.
With that being
Don't
said,
forget to promote your channel.
yeah. With that being said, my
Oh,
YouTube
yeah.
channel is Thomas Apologia. Please like, subscribe, consider becoming a member.
Hey.
This guy's CriticalThomist. You want to say anything?
CriticalThomist, man. Better
Critical
subscribe.
Thomas.
You get it.
With that being said, God bless.
God bless you. God bless your family. Well done, brother. Take care.
Bless, brother.
Cut.
Oh, Revelation.
Yeah, Revelation. It's okay. That's fine. You can put it here. Let me put it here.
After